Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today James and I are back on the Beastcoast Pokemon channel to talk about all the recent VGC regionals that have taken place and give you some idea of where the metagame has been and where it's going. So we'll be discussing a bunch of results from the recent regional championships and yeah, just cover everything that's been going on in the format at the moment. So super excited to do these breakdowns for you, and yeah, I'm ready to get into things. Hey guys, Cybertron. Relax! I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you?
I'm feeling pretty good. I love analyzing the regionals. It really just helps me figure out like what's popular, what's to beat, and gives me some ideas sometimes, because I love taking inspiration from some of the regionals teams that do well and some of the teams that might not have performed well, but maybe there's some like ideas that I can grab and kind of twist into my own team. So I always love analyzing regionals, and I'm really glad to be here with you for analyzing two different regional championships as well as the Battle Stadium season for March.
Let's just dive right into things, starting off with Salt Lake City regionals, which took place about 2 weeks ago or so. And so this was the first US regionals in about 2 years, and I actually attended it, which was a really fun experience in itself. We can talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, I think, this team had a lot of teams that did well that we expected to do well, especially with, Groudon, Zashi, and Charizard's Sun winning the event. And then there were some kind of more niche compositions that made it to that top 8 that I thought were really cool. Solgaleo plus Calyrex Shadow Rider in 5th place, as well as Necrozma, Duskmane, and Kyogre in 7th place as well. So yeah, just looking at the overall results, like what did you think about the top performing teams and any specific Pokemon or teams that caught your eye?
Yeah, I think we talked about in our preview where we were talking about like Solgaleo, Dialga, and how we thought a lot of the steel restricteds were just really good because they have the option to boost defense with Max Steel Spike and Max Quake. They're also decently well against Zacian teams. And yeah, it's really no surprise to see them pretty much come up. I mean, we had a combination of both newer players and older players do really well in this event. And I think it was just pretty cool seeing like a bunch of different restricted pairs like really go into the top 8, because we had, I believe, 7 different pairs. Yeah, 7 different pairs with like only 5 Zacians. Yeah, 3 of the teams didn't have Zacian, so I think it's pretty incredible to see that. And yeah, there were definitely some pretty cool individual Pokemon picks as well, and we saw a lot of standard stuff too, and some just had some different variations, because like for instance, we had 2 different Sun teams with the exact same 6, but they had a few different sets which really I think played differently towards what matchup they were playing against.
Yeah, I think right now the story of the format is all about how do you beat this Sun composition, right? This team was originally created by a Japanese player called Rinya, and in the original version of the team it was Trick, Iron Ball, Grimmsnarl, and Charizard with just everything double fire type attack. And the current version of the team, the one that won regionals by Chongjun Peng, I think had some very small adaptations that actually gave him a absolutely huge advantage, right? He turned the Grimmsnarl from Iron Ball into dual screens with Light Clay, and then the Charizard not only had Ancient Power, but also had Charty Berry, so it was basically an absolute nightmare to fight against if you were using Charizard and Sun yourself. And so those 2 small changes in itself I thought were really brilliant, and so I actually played Chongjun in round 8 of Swiss as well as top 8, and as a Charizard player myself, like it was so hard to break through, and I essentially like couldn't play with my typical strategy with Charizard. I actually ran Ancient Power Charizard for the tournament as well because I thought it was kind of an underrated move, and I figured there'd be a lot of Sun teams, so normally that was my answer against Sun, but Chongjun was one step ahead and actually had the Charty Berry as well. And so there are a lot of variants of this team running around at the moment, but the 6 Pokemon are still the same: Zacian, Groudon, Instinct, Gastro, Charizard, and Grim. And it's just so consistent. Like, I'm eager to see if anyone's able to come up with the team that not only can hard beat this composition, but also have a neutral / favorable matchup against all the other restricted duos that you mentioned. And I actually didn't even notice that at Salt Lake, yeah, there were 7 unique duos out of 8, which I think is really cool. So I think the thing about the format is, yes, there's like a couple that you really need to prepare for, but there's so many other duos that are also very viable that players may not have prepped against as hard.
I mean, yeah, I think that this team definitely beatable. The 6 are for sure beatable, but of course Charizard mirrors in Sun are really difficult, and yeah, the Charty Berry definitely gave Chongjun an advantage right there. And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of teams that could probably beat the 6, but of course, I think the big point is, can they have a neutral or positive matchup against most of the other formats? Because a lot of those teams probably lean towards negative in a lot of different matchups, so that's basically where you got to find a balance. But yeah, we definitely saw some interesting Pokemon in the top 8 for Salt Lake City. We saw a Tapu Fini, for instance, in 5th place, which, you know, we don't really see too much. I mean, Tapu Fini we saw a lot in the previous formats, but never really been that great in the restricted format for at least Generation 8.
Yep.
But yeah, we saw a Tapu Fini place well. We saw like Life Orb Yveltal, which this was like basically the same 6 that Snow used to get 11th place at the February IC, or it was March IC, I believe, actually, where they had this exact same 6, and this Yveltal has been really popular recently on the stadium ladder. Then we got like a really interesting Necrozma Dustmane, which is a Pokemon we don't really see as much. We usually see the Solgaleo because preventing the Intimidate with Full Metal Body is just so good. But the fact that we saw this interesting Necrozma set alongside an interesting tech on the Mimikyu, it was a light screen Mimikyu, and I believe it was this first, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was the player's first regional competitive wise. So that was just really cool to see. It also had Choice Band and Regieleki. And then your team was very interesting, and it definitely surprised me when I watched it on stream. Why not talk about your team and your experience with the event?
For sure, yeah. I mean, first of all, I think like credits to the tournament organizers, because the event was honestly really well run. It did take a little bit longer than expected to get started because like just locking everyone's battle box like took, it felt like, you know, an extra hour than normally. But the venue was honestly huge. They had, you know, a lot of just great ways to kind of spread out players. You know, like we've been to a lot of regionals where things feel really cramped and there's just not a lot of space, but the venue was really good. Like the tables were really spread out. They had, you know, vax checks going into the event, and everyone was masked up basically throughout the entire tournament. And so basically they had all the right safety precautions to make you feel as safe as possible, which I think was great. And yeah, the overall event, once it got started, I thought was really smooth. It's definitely cool to, you know, see the live streams come back as well, and overall playing in it was just exhilarating because, you know, I haven't played super seriously in too many events in the last really 5 years or so, but it was really, really fun. And I think that I mean, the experience itself was awesome. Like it just felt so good to compete again. And so I brought a team that you know, it's funny, we were doing that preview video and we were talking about Dialga and Solgaleo, and I was like at that point already focusing on making them work, but I really struggled with Dialga, and then Solgaleo kind of came together like 2 days before the event, and yeah, it just ended up working out even better than I'd expected. I thought it was a good meta call, and honestly, I felt pretty confident against everyone else in that top 8, but Chongjun just like had the one tech with the Ancient Power and the Chardy that was so difficult to break through, and he actually played very differently from when I played him in Swiss versus in top 8 as well. And so I prepped really hard for like an Incineroar Grimmsnarl lead, which he had gone with both times when we played in Swiss, and then he just adapted to Charizard Groudon and then like didn't bring Grim at all, which I thought was really smart. And so his prep was really good, and it was honestly one of the best runs I've ever seen from a player in regionals. Like he went, I think 22-2 overall is his game record, which is crazy in a best of 3 regionals format.
Yeah, that is really impressive. And you decided to go with like a Choice Scarf Groudon this time, where we don't really see Choice Scarf Groudon. We see Choice Scarf Kyogre quite a bit, but usually Groudon we saw like a Solvest as the common one for this tournament. But how did the Choice Scarf Groudon really come into play for your team?
Yeah, I think like my goals going into this tournament were to just be like proactive and basically catch my opponents off guard. And this format, I think, is one of the hardest formats I've played in VGC because there's so much that can go wrong, and there's a lot of like random shenanigans that can catch you off guard as well. And so I don't love using a lot of those like random shenanigans just because I often feel like they're not consistent enough to like make it to the very top of a tournament. But at the same time, you have to be like really wary of all of it, whether it be like trick, you know, eject button, for example, or just random moves that can one-shot your Dynamax restricted. So basically my goal was, okay, well, is there any way that I can have a consistent strategy where I can win the game in a turn, but also not rely on, you know, this one big move, and if it goes wrong, I lose immediately. And so, first of all, I think very few people were prepared for this restricted duo, just because I think a lot of Solgaleos were often paired maybe with Kyogre more frequently, and so yeah, people just didn't expect it. And then on your question about the Scarf Groudon, like that is such a random item, right? And so I had a lot of game ones where basically I'd win the game on the first turn because Groudon would just get Bulldoze off, Solgaleo would get the policy off, I'd lower the speed of whatever's Dynamaxing, and then Solgaleo would just one-shot it, for example. And so being able to win the game in one turn can be really valuable in this format. But once again, it's like I wanted to make sure that this strategy was consistent, even if my opponent knew it was Choice Scarf Groudon, and have the right adaptations going into like games 2 and 3, for example. But yeah, ended up, I think, being a really solid call. Solgaleo in itself was really impressive. Like, it just one-shot so many things when Dynamaxed, and the team was overall really fun to play because you had so many means of speed control. It was like Bulldoze on Groudon, Rock Tomb on Groudon, Max Airstream from Charizard, Tailwind from Whimsicott, and Trick Room from Mimikyu, and it like really creates mind games as to like what means I'm going to go with. And with best of 3, there's so much flexibility you can go with as well.
Yeah, and of course, where can the viewers find the team if they want to try it out?
Yeah, I posted a team report on this on my own channel, so definitely go check that out. And yeah, like overall, I think it was really fun. But looking at the other teams from Salt Lake, I'd say, you know, a lot of the top performing teams, like, you know, the top 3 teams, like Groudon, Zacian, Kyogre, Zacian, those were all relatively normal and expected. But, you know, you mentioned a bunch of these interesting picks, like Calyrex-Ice and Necrozma Kyogre. I think your point on the Steel Restricted is really interesting, right? Because Dialga didn't make it into the top 8. We were hyping that a lot going into the tournament. I still think that's a Pokemon that's really underexplored, and that's one that I think has a lot of hype building into the future. But, you know, looking beyond the top 8 as well, there are just a lot of cool, you know, unique Pokemon that we don't see too frequently. A player called Vichy had Cinderace and Dracozolt in the top 16, which is really neat. And then we also saw a Alolan Executor at 18th place from Gary Chian, as well as some other niche picks like Wolfie with Pheromosa, Umbreon from Diego Chan, and then Max Simon with both Pikachu and Butterfree. He had one of the most impressive wins on stream with it. I actually played against him in round 6, and it was really scary. And then there was a Centiskorch in 31 as well. So I think for the most part, like a lot of the, you know, restricteds are Pokemon that we expected to do well, but it is cool that some of the more unique duos made it into the top 8, and I don't think that's a coincidence either.
Yeah, I think the one big interesting note is one duo that we just really hyped up about because it was like really well performing in the international challenges, but seemed to have fell off for this regional, was Calyrex-Ice Rider combined with Palkia, as we only saw one make it into the top 32, I believe, and that was Wolf, who was, I believe, 5-0 starting off this tournament. So yeah, what did you think about Calyrex-Ice Rider Palkia throughout the tournament? Did you fight some maybe in the early rounds and maybe they just didn't do as well, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think some players brought it, but honestly not as many as I'd expected. Like both you and I were hyping it up a lot going into Salt Lake, and I still think it's a really good core, but I think maybe just fewer players ended up actually picking it because I think a lot of high-level players just haven't used that as much as some of the other cores, and maybe just didn't feel as comfortable with it. So I was definitely surprised to only see one in the top 32, and I like made sure that I had a positive matchup against it. That's why I ran safety goggles like Taunt Mimikyu, because it really, I think, has a pretty good matchup against almost everything on that team. So yeah, I still think that I can see it doing well, right? We saw it get second in the regionals in Australia right before Salt Lake, and so I think this was more just a lot of players like, you know, first tournament back, wanting to rely on what they're maybe comfortable with. And yeah, Palkia and Calyrex is something that's only popped up more recently. So definitely underperformed relative to expectations, but I also just think like not that many players ran it. Like that's my personal hypothesis.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a complicated team as well, because I feel like it's more like a hard Trick Room team, and we usually see a hard Trick Room do really well in the beginning of the format, especially in Gen 8, but then it kind of falls off quite a bit here, and I think we definitely saw that. And I feel like a lot of the teams that did do really well in Salt Lake City just had pretty good tools in order to handle it, because he saw like a lot of the Steel Restricteds. Yveltal definitely gives us some issues. Incineroar, Ferrothorn, like Calyrex Shadow Rider, like these are all Pokemon that are generally good against a duo. And I feel like it's definitely more of a, you usually have game plans with Calyrex-Ice Rider Palkia, especially because of the Trick Room. You have to kind of flowchart a lot of matchups, and maybe some players I think just had ideas for that, but I wasn't at Salt Lake City, so I don't know about like if there were a lot of Calyrex-Ice Rider Palkia players, but I do know a few friends who did try out the variant at regionals, and it just didn't really work out for them because it seemed like a lot of players just had like the techs in order to beat it.
For sure, yeah. And so speaking of Calyrex and Palkia, now let's take a look at the Liverpool regionals results, because it also did not manage to break into the top 8 there, but did actually finish in 11th place. And there were a couple of more. It also finished in 20th place at the event, and then 32nd as well. So 3 in the top 32, but none making it into the top 8. And the top 2 teams from Liverpool very much, once again, similar to what we saw from Salt Lake. Zacian, Groudon, Instinct, Gastro, Charizard, and Grim taking first place again. So, yeah, I can't remember really the last time that we had like the same team win back-to-back regionals. And this, first place at Liverpool was Eric Rios, who's a very seasoned veteran. So I don't know kind of the version that he ran and whether or not it was also the Chardy plus Ancient Power set. That might be the case, but there are a lot of small deviations you can run, even in terms of item or single move choice with the Mons. And then second place, Thomas, a player called Thomas, running Kyogre Zacian, but this one didn't have Tailwind. Instead, it actually had like Shedinja and Thundurus as well. And so, once again, I think, yeah, we've talked about Groudon Zacian, Kyogre Zacian, and you might, if you guys watched our top 5 like restricted cores, those were very much, within the top 5. And so, not surprising to see those continue to dominate. But then after first and second, actually, there were a lot of interesting teams, right? Like, Ben Grismer here running a team with Galarian Darmanitan, as well as Hyper Offense with Calyrex and Zacian, which I think is really, really cool. You had Yveltal Groudon with Bronzong in 4th place. You had a Lunala in 6th place. Lunala actually making a bunch of appearances at this event. And then if you go further past that top 16, like there was Necrozma plus Yveltal actually right at 16th place, Lunala and Groudon right at 17th place, and then Reshiram plus Calyrex-Ice Rider in 27th. And so it's really cool once again to see some of the more obscure restricted duos pop up. And some of these were just literally not on my radar at all, like Yveltal, Necrozma.
Yeah, it's always really interesting to see because this was 1 week between the events, so I don't think the meta really changed too much in general. But it's always interesting to see like the comparisons between like different regions because North America and Europe usually have very different deviations. Like when I played at EUIC, for instance, in 2019, there were a lot of things that were really different compared to like what I would normally face on ladder. And I think if I went to a North American regional, yeah, like it's just interesting like how their picks end up changing. And yeah, we just saw like, I believe we saw a lot of Zacian Kyogres especially too at this event, even though like one of the biggest threats was the Sun team. And depending on the matchup, it can be even. It's usually a little bit negative, hard to deal with, but yeah, it's just really interesting to see so many Zacian Kyogres, I think, break out at this event. We also saw like quite a bit of just, again, interesting restrictions, as you mentioned before. It's just really cool to see that we see all these different restricted pairs in the top 32. And again, I think Lunala coming back is something cool because you actually mentioned Lunala, I think, when we were first previewing the format, where you said that Lunala was super underrated. And yeah, definitely I think it has a role here because Power Herb, of course, with Meteor Beam can threaten Charizard. Even after the Chardy Berry, it could still do a lot of damage. And then you have Wide Guard for opposing Groudon. It definitely seems like a cool Pokemon right now in the format.
For sure, yeah. I think one thing that was really cool about the Liverpool results was that there were a bunch more like kind of, I wouldn't call them, I guess, obscure Pokemon, but Pokemon that we don't see very frequently. Like Shedinja is one actually, like, I think you and I actually had talked about a bunch even before Salt Lake City. And so, this new set that's popped up, running like Endure as well as the Focus Sash to hang around for a little bit longer. Ally Switch is just such a hard move to play around. And so, yeah, that, Shedinja actually ended up getting 2nd place at the tournament. Ben Grismer, I think, as I just mentioned, had a really cool Hyper Offense team. He actually had Eject button on Whimsicott, as well as Choice Scarf, Galarian Darmanitan, and then Choice Band Urshifu, as well as Focus Sash, Calyrex Shadow Rider with Imprison and Trick Room. And I think he ran like 252, like max attack or max special attack or speed on basically every Pokemon on his team. So it's cool to see like that kind of Hyper Offense still has a place in the format, right? And then you've got Bronzong, for example, more Shedinjas down in the top 16. There's this cool team with Suicune, Charizard, Venusaur, and Groudon plus Solgaleo, which I definitely caught my eye. Like, Suicune, I think, is really interesting because it's, obviously a valuable Tailwind user, and you can't stop it from Fake Out because it's got Inner Focus. So that's pretty cool. We talked about Lunala a bunch. There was a Dusclops that popped up, and it's funny, like, Dusclops and Porygon were so common throughout all of Sword and Shield, but I feel like they kind of fell out of popularity, especially more recently, but then now I've seen them, like, resurging again and coming back, and so I think, like, that's really interesting as well. And then there was a Dragapult in 28th. Once again, Dragapult, one of those Pokemon that we've seen so much of in Sword and Shield, but maybe not as much in the restricted format. So overall, yeah, like, overwhelmingly looking at the results, it was still very much Zacian, Kyogre, and Groudon Zacian dominated, right? But there was a lot of unique stuff that popped up as well. But to me, the big question is basically, how do you build something that's consistent enough to win a tournament, right? Because I don't think it's a coincidence that the Zacian Groudon team and the Kyogre Zacians are still making it to the very top, and that's because they have a neutral to favorable matchup, it feels like, against everything, right? And so when a good player pilots them, really is able to take it to the top. And that's kind of how it felt like at Salt Lake, where it felt really difficult to beat Chongjun because I had a team that was equipped for a lot of things, but not enough for one of the more consistent teams in the format that had that specific Ancient Power and Charty Berry tech. And so I think that's also part of the reason why you see a lot of these unique picks maybe make it to the top 8 and the top 4, but ultimately not win the event. And so that's where I feel like the format is right now. Like you have to be able to are you able to figure out a way to beat that Zacian Groudon stuff? You already talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think that's this is the team to beat right now, and you shouldn't hyper focus on only beating this team. But now everyone, if you're building new stuff, like you can't have a bad matchup against it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think like Chongjun's version specifically, like he took what usually was going to be, I believe, Life Orb Charizard was probably the most common on that team before, and he chose to run the Charty Berry instead. I think like it just made the Mirror and other Sun teams a lot more doable, because Life Orb would probably just allow more favorable matchups in general, where you can pick up KO certainly with the Life Orb Charizard, and it'd make it a lot more hell for like teams that just don't have an answer to Life Orb Charizard. Like it does so much damage with Solar Power. It can KO Pokemon through Dynamax. It's absolutely insane. But without Life Orb, I think it makes more matchups a bit more neutral, but definitely helps in that one matchup. And I think I think a lot of the teams, in order to do well in this format, you can sacrifice some good matchups to have more neutral matchups, but you got to have like a better general spread across, because this format, again, we saw so many different restricted pairs and duos and combinations. Like even like a lot of the Zacian Ogres teams, they run different partners as well, and you kind of need something that's consistent against like a general spread. And I think that's what Chongjun did with his version of his team specifically, where the Charty Berry kind of just like helped make the Sun Mirror more playable, and probably took matchups that were probably more advantageous for like a Life Orb Charizard and made it more like neutral, but he could still play around it because he had enough tools to deal with it.
Yeah, going up against him, it was like a nightmare because the Charty and the Shuka on Instant plus screens from Grimmsnarl made it so difficult to pick up knockouts. He was really good at like recognizing when to use Wildfire as well and when not to, and go for something like Airstream as well. And so with so much bulk on the team, it was like, yeah, maybe you give up a little bit of damage and you don't pick up a one-hit knockout, but then you get to stick around for a little bit longer and have a much better matchup into Groudon with Max Rockfall or opposing Charizards with Ancient Power. So yeah, I think it's a good time to continue talking about this team because, there are the results from the most recent ranked season, and there aren't too many teams that have actually been revealed yet, but first place was a Japanese player called Kinigawa, who had his own version of Zacian Groudon, and this one was also a little bit different, right? Once again, same 6 Pokemon, but the sets were actually slightly different. It was Life Orb Charizard with Dragon Pulse, actually, and then he also had Burning Jealousy on both Incineroar and Grimmsnarl, and it was Babiri on Grimmsnarl, still Life Orb on the Charizard as well. And so once again, it's like you can run the same 6 Pokemon, but just even an item choice or a move choice can completely change kind of how you might play with it in certain matchups. And so like, yeah, running a Dragon type attack on Charizard is really interesting because it allows you to have a more favorable matchup into Palkia, which is a Pokemon that both you and I, have been talking about trending upwards a little bit more in the recent months. And I think a lot of Japanese players especially were using Palkia plus, Calyrex-Ice right around the ladder. And so that team in itself, once again, so many different ways to run it.
Yeah, his version was definitely interesting. It even had it was also screens, but it wasn't Light Clay. It was Babiri Berry with Burn Jealousy on the Grimmsnarl. And the Groudon, normally on this team, you would see Heavy Slam for the Steel Spike boost, but this one actually had Shadow Claw on the Groudon. So Max Phantasm, I thought, was like a really cool option because you have a lot of physical power with Groudon and Zacian, be able to do a lot of damage after that Max Phantasm drop, and I thought like that was a really cool tech. It also probably would help out against like Lunala matchup and Calyrex Shadow Rider, of course. So I think it was just really cool to see like how many different takes. Like this was also a thing I think in previous years where we had very common teams like the Kangaskhan in 2015 with like Landorus Thundurus, but really some items, some move changes can really make the difference and make it feel like a completely different matchup.
Absolutely, yeah. And looking at some of the other teams that were in that top 30 of the ranked season, once again, Calyrex Palkia, one player actually used it to get 15th and 16th, the exact same comp with the Moongus, Dusclops, Instant, and Regieleki. And then a couple of really cool restricted pairs here. Binge with Xerneas and Zacian. Binge's been, one of the best players in the Sword and Shield era, always really high up in the rank ladder. Got second at Dallas Regionals back in 2020. And so, yeah, using Xerneas in the format I think is really, really intriguing, and obviously not a very common pick. But he actually had some really interesting sets on his team. The Xerneas actually had Hyper Beam, so allowing it to max strike when Dynamaxed. He had Imprison on his Zacian with max speed. There's Swords Dance, Life Orb Landorus. Bulky Shookaberry Torkoal with Body Press and Yawn, Weakness Policy on Gigantamax Venusaur, and then Heal Pulse on Indeedee as well with Mystical Fire, so you could self-activate the policy on Venusaur. So Xerneas is a restricted that we don't see very much of at all, partially because of its negative matchup against Zacian. It's just so bad into Zacian, but you can see how Binge built around it, right? Not only having Imprison to stop opposing Zacians, but also a Landorus, a Torkoal, and a Weather Ball Venusaur turning into Max Flare. So it's like so much anti-Zacian stuff to maybe enable Xerneas a little bit more.
Yeah, I actually played Binge on during the last few days of the ranked ladder, and that Indeedee definitely caught me off guard with the Mystical Fire and Heal Pulse option. It definitely was a big threat. And then we also had like a Tang who ended up running a Solvest Reshiram with Screens Grimstone, and it was like a really fun team I actually got to play around with. And yeah, it's just really interesting that you see like some choices here. Like we see the Reshiram, we see Swampert lower on 29th, and it's just really cool, I think, to see some of these small individual Pokemon that just like provide a certain role. Like with Xerneas, of course, we mentioned earlier how it's just so hard to use Xerneas in this format with Dynamax, and of course Zacian's running around, but like these small techs on other partners can really just make the difference right here. And I think it's just really cool to see, and I wouldn't be surprised how much it will evolve later on as the format continues to develop. Like what kind of restricted Pokemon that we thought wouldn't do as well in the beginning, like can we see them like take a whole new stage and become like the top of the meta? Like I think no one really expected Calyrex-Ice Rider Palkia to be like a really dominant core as it was until like it started really popping off in the February IC.
Absolutely, yeah. So moving on a little bit away from results and just talking more generally now, what do you think are the biggest teams to beat, right? I think we've talked a lot about the Groudon, Charizard, Zacian comp, and I think that will continue to be very dominant, right? It's funny, back in VGC 2016, which was a restricted format, we had this team called Big Six, right? And it was dominant right from the beginning all the way to the end, centered around Groudon plus Xerneas. And in the end, it actually kind of fell off at the World Championships because a lot of players prepped super, super hard for it, made sure that they could beat it really well. But leading up until Worlds, and it still did well at Worlds, right? But didn't necessarily win. That being said, I could see Groudon Sun continue to be like that. I know some players have talked a lot about Wheezing, which I want to pick your brain on a little bit as well, because it's something that has, popped up on people's radars recently, but I personally think it's one of the hardest Pokemon in the format to use. So yeah, we've talked about the Sun team, we've talked about Kyogre, Zacian, but what other teams would you recommend players really try to, focus on when team building right now in the metagame?
I think it's more it's pretty much the same, I think, as the beginning, really. I feel like in this format you should just approach to have general, neutral, or positive matchups against most things, and try to make sure that your negative matchups aren't like something that's like impossible to beat. And I don't really feel like it's really changed, because I think we're seeing the same restricted duos still do pretty well. Maybe there's some here and there that definitely that are changing, right? Because you don't see Xerneas, you don't see Reshiram, you don't see Necrozma, Dustmane nearly as much. But I feel like in general, you should always, if you're not building against those specifically, you should at least have a game plan or some techs on your team that are like good in general matchups that can help out in those positions where you're facing those teams. And yeah, I think regardless, no matter what, it's just going to be a lot of the same restricted duos doing well. I think there's people who are just going to take new spins on it. And for instance, we could see like Zacian, Kyogre, and then like you mentioned about Wheezing. And yeah, it's actually something that I've been experimenting around with recently, and it's pretty fun. And I think it's just like as the format continues to develop, yeah, there'll be some points where you focus more on these kinds of teams that you want to focus to prepare for, like the Groudon, Zacian teams, but you still want to prepare for like everything else, right? You don't want to like instant lose to like a Yveltal or a Lunala. You want to make sure you have those matchups like that are playable for the most part. So I think like, yeah, it's fine to focus on the Zacian Groudon and Zacian Kyogre. I think Zacian Calyrex Shadow Rider, Palkia Calyrex-Ice Rider, they should still be prepped for. And it's really just like maybe focus on the top teams specifically, and you still want to have at least neutral matchups though across the board. And I don't see that changing. I think that's how it was for 16. And it's probably still going to be the same, I think, for this format regardless.
Yeah, I'd say like one thing that I think is really valuable is comfort in this format, right? Like rather than like memorizing every specific matchup, just knowing the fundamentals of your team, I think can be really valuable, because the reality is like at regionals, I actually didn't really play against too many Zacian Kyogres, which I thought, I would really run into, especially like the variant with Grimmsnarl and Zapdos and Incident Rillaboom. So that didn't actually pop up really at all during my Swiss rounds, but I ran into other pairs like Solgaleo plus Kyogre. I ran into a Kyurem White team plus Zacian, right? And so these are the teams that you're probably not going to have as much practice against, but you don't want to just be completely clueless when you go up against them, right? And so maybe you haven't like prepped for them super hard in the team building process, but if you're comfortable with your team and you at least like know all the different outs that you have, it can be really valuable, rather than like trying to really break the meta, but then suddenly like you don't really know how to play against some of these more obscure duels. Because I think the reality is at a tournament, the majority of your games will probably still be up against the standard stuff like Kyogre Zacian or Groudon Zacian, really anything plus Zacian, but you are going to run into a fair amount of like unique restricted duels that you probably have not practiced very much against, and so being able to adapt on the fly and figure out new game plans against those are also valuable.
Yes, I can definitely relate. In 2019, I think people know me as like the guy who ran the same team. Literally did not change even for Worlds 2019. Yeah. I decided I'm not going to bring a Mega Evolution because really, I preferred Cortana, and I don't think I needed a Mega on that team. And Cortana was just such a big comfort pick for me because I knew what it did. I knew what matchups I would want to bring it in. And yeah, like, sure, I could have had a Mega Evolution like Kang that we saw get top 8 as well, or like Mega Metagross, which was a really strong Steel type back then. But I feel like comfort and just knowing your matchups is like a really big thing, especially in restricted formats, because again, a lot of the team building is generally based around duos for the most part in this format.
Yeah.
And you're just going to fight like a lot of different duos. At the end of the day, there are a bunch of players going to regionals, a bunch of players going to nationals or internationals, a bunch of players going to worlds. You can find all these different restricted duos. So it doesn't matter if you can beat the top 5 teams, but if you can't beat players who are bringing these other stuff as well, then you won't even probably get to face some of those top teams potentially. So I think it's really just like knowing the ins and outs of your teams, knowing like what to bring in what situation, what techs you need, and all the different kinds of aspects you need to focus on.
Absolutely, yeah. So, that kind of leads to the final point to kind of talk about, which is just general predictions for where you think the metagame is going. I think based off the results that we've seen from regionals, it's clear that the comps that we've expected to do well continue to do well for the most part, although Calyrex and Palkia maybe hasn't performed as well in tournaments. But then you've had a lot of new restricted Pokemon pop up, right? Like Solgaleo's had some good performances, Necrozma Duskmane has had some performances, Lunala has popped up, Reshiram has popped up, Xerneas has popped up, and so it's like a lot of these restricteds that were kind of just on the fringe of doing well, and hadn't had like too many good performances, but was able to break into the top of whatever results or tournaments that they performed in. One thing that I do want to actually kind of quickly talk about is, you and I both had high hopes for Dialga going into regionals, but I think there was only one Dialga team in the top 32 of both Salt Lake City and Liverpool, which is actually maybe a little bit surprising to me. I think that's one Pokemon that still has a lot of potential, but people still just haven't figured it out as much because there hasn't been too much time to explore it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just a bad Pokemon. So what do you think?
No, I think that's definitely something that can be considered because, yeah, like even if we think at the end of the day that something does well, who knows? Maybe other players are just not comfortable with it, or maybe it's just not good at the current time period. And I definitely had some experiences with like that before, where I'm still not the biggest fan of Groudon, and I'm still surprised that the Groudon teams are doing as well as they are doing. But at the end of the day, it just really comes down to how well the player is playing with their team, what kind of comfort level do they have, because at the end of the day, I think Dialga, like we've only really seen, again, Dialga plus Zacian for the most part at tournaments, and we've seen like maybe 1 or 2 Dialga Kyogres, but I still think it's rare, and I do think it's a duo that is definitely still worth exploring and still can do really well in this format. It's just a tough remaining, because you want a lot of things for the remaining 4 Pokemon to cover up, and of course both restricteds are reliant on their special attack, which can be shut down by like Light Screen and Snarl. So there's like a lot of things you do have to prepare for when you're using Dialga and Kyogre. Also with Dialga, you generally want to max, I feel like, with your Dialga, so that might lead more room to like not have Pokemon that want to max as well, unless you want a secondary max, which is usually fine. But then after that, like you don't want to bring, like for instance, Charizard usually wants to Dynamax. The Groudon can also want to Dynamax, but the other Pokemon I think on the common Rinya Sun teams don't really want to max much. They usually just focus on those two maxes. Maybe in some other situations they will, but they can still be really good outside of max. And I think that's like one of the problems with building with Dialga is usually Dialga does want to max in most cases, and then you only have room for one other max Pokemon, and then the rest are usually just support Pokemon that can do well outside of Dynamax, which I think makes it a little bit harder to build around.
Absolutely. Yeah, that all makes sense. And so I think, you know, the format's in a place where the top comps have continued to really prove their worth. I like knew the, you know, Rinya Sun team was strong, but I didn't realize just how good it was until like I played against it at regionals, and seeing it win 2 back-to-back regionals, as well as, you know, continuing to finish first on the online ladder just goes to show like this team is kind of like one step above the rest, I feel like, in terms of consistency right now. And so that's still going to be, you know, the number one team to beat. But it's cool to see a new influx of kind of non-restricted Pokemon pop up. You know, we talked about Shedinja. I think the Darmanitan with Choice Scarf really interesting, to be able to one-shot a lot of things with moves like Icicle Crash, Superpower, Rock Slide, and Flare Blitz. I think a lot of these more like niche Pokemon, like you shouldn't just throw onto your teams because you're like, oh, this is niche, right? Like people won't expect it. It's more about how it kind of fits into the overall composition. You'll see that, for example, Wolfie ran Pheromosa with Speed Swap, and the whole idea is that so that you could sweep with Calyrex-Ice Rider, which is typically a slow Pokemon in end games, right? And so when you use these really niche Pokemon, they have to have a reason. They have to really synergize well, especially with the restricteds on your team. But if you can find those that players won't expect, it can really go a long way.
100% agree.
All right, that is going to be it for our metagame recap for now. So we hope you found this interesting. Hope you found it helpful. As always, would love any feedback as we continue to build out this kind of content on the channel here at Beastcoast. So thanks so much for joining James and I today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Beastcoast Pokemon channel as well as our individual channels, all linked in the description below. And yeah, thanks so much as always for watching.